we're delighted to have her join us for our webinar, Stopping Disinformation and Disinformation and Physicians and Patients. Today's webinar is the latest webinar in the Fsmb's virtual education program, which offers presentations and topics important to medical regulators and the public. Health-related disinformation is not a new phenomenon, but during the COVID-19 pandemic, greatly accelerated by social media, create distrust in improved and other public health measures. When disinformation is spread by life, who inherently carry a high degree of public trust, significant challenges for state medical boards, to carry out their mission to protect patients. Physicians who spread incorrect and false COVID-19 vaccine information can erode trust in the medical profession and, worse, put patients in harm's way. During our webinar, our speakers will discuss how disinformation deeply impacts physicians and the patients they treat, the prevalence of disinformation on various social media platforms, and developing trends in medical regulation for addressing it, including efforts on the part of the Fsmb. It is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished presenters. Imran Ahmed is the founding CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. He's a recognized authority on the social and psychological dynamics of social media, as well as what goes wrong in those spaces, such as trolling, identity-based hate, misinformation, conspiracy theories, modern extremism, and fake news. Mr. Ahmed is a regularly featured expert in the media on the international anti-vaccine movement, shedding light on who is behind it and why they are doing it. Recent research and reports by the Center for Countering Digital Hate, including the Anti-Vax Playbook and the Disinformation Dozen, exposed spreaders of anti-vaccine disinformation on social media platforms and demonstrated how anti-vax influencers profit from disseminating disinformation. Katie Templeton is an attorney with expertise in all phases of healthcare law, litigation, and claims management, focusing on medical outcomes, patient safety, and best practices. She's been a public member on the Oklahoma State Board of Osteopathic Examiners for more than 7 years, now serving in the role of board president. She also serves on the state's opioid task force, writing best practice guidelines for physicians on opioid prescribing and legislative compliance. In May of 2020, Ms. Templeton was elected as a public member to the Fsmb Board of Directors. This year, she was appointed chair of the Fsmb's Ethics and Professionalism Committee, leading the group in developing a statement on the inappropriate dissemination of COVID-19 vaccine misinformation and disinformation by physicians. We will begin today's session with comments from Mr. Ahmed.
Thank you so much. In a crisis like a pandemic, the greatest gift that we can give to each other is that of good advice. And we have seen a crisis throughout the coronavirus pandemic, a parallel pandemic that has reinforced the biological contagion of coronavirus with misinformation that has worsened that biological contagion. This parallel social pandemic of misinformation has consumed an enormous amount of time, both from the media, but also from professionals who've had to contend with misinformation that has made it more difficult for them to do their jobs. In a moment like this, authority matters, reputation matters. In a pandemic of misinformation, the signifiers of epistemic weight, to how much confidence you should put into the information you hear, really, really matter. And one of the hardest things to communicate to physicians and public health officials throughout this pandemic has been that reputation and weight matter. And that there is another side trying to persuade people that you cannot be trusted. And that's precisely what they're seeking to do. Anti-vaxxers only seek to persuade people of three things. Now, this is not just my contention. This is based on us spending time inside the spaces in which they organize. The key activists for that movement, and there's only a few of them, they're only seeking to persuade people of three things. One is coronavirus isn't that bad. The second is that vaccines are somehow unsafe. The third is that you can't trust doctors. You can't trust public health officials. You can't trust the medical profession or science itself. And if those were to be commonly believed, we would have a pandemic, we would have been incapable of containing this pandemic, and we would have a crisis like you wouldn't believe. So how has the Fsmb responded? Well, in this moment of enormous peril for patients, in which a strong defense of science, of scientists, of medicine, of medics is not just necessary, but is the means by which you protect the public from disinformation. State medical boards have, I am sad to say, utterly failed the profession. They have not just failed to protect physicians, they have empowered the worst physicians among you, those who have put profit before people and put at risk millions of lives. While the world has taken unprecedented measures to protect ourselves, putting ourselves in the hands of doctors and scientists, and I count myself as a member of the public that has had to listen to that advice and do things which I never thought possible, to voluntarily cut myself off from the sources of love and succor in my own life. Doing our utmost to protect ourselves, the people we love, our communities, our nations, I'm afraid that state medical boards have wrung their hands in the face of the crisis in front of them and said, sorry, we can't do nothing. And this isn't the first time, of course. You would have thought that state medical boards had learned from the opioid epidemic, the NASA case, Dr. Death, and more. But no, as we speak, a year and a half into this deadly global pandemic, doctors are still leveraging the licenses they've received from your boards to spread vaccine disinformation. Every day, patients and millions of the general public across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and other social media platforms are receiving dangerous and deadly lies from anti-vaccine activists who can call themselves doctor still, 2 years into this crisis. People like Rashid Buttar, who was featured on CNN last night, spouting the most egregious kinds of nonsense. These doctors, by virtue of their title and of their licensing by state medical boards, carry your stamp of approval, and it is a stamp of approval. They have your stamp of approval, your de facto and de jure backing when they tell the public that vaccines make you magnetic and cause infertility. Nearly 3 months ago, the Fsmb put out a strongly worded statement warning that doctors who spread misinformation and disinformation risk losing their licenses. And what's happened since then? I ask from the position of a member of the public who wants action to be taken against doctors who disinform. Well, sadly, basically nothing. In fact, Sherry Tenpenny, one of the worst spreaders of anti-vaccine disinformation in the country, who said before on an Ohio legislative committee that vaccines make you magnetic, but she said a lot worse too, submitted her application in September for license renewal. We FOIA'd it. And in that application, she affirms that she's under investigation, but nevertheless, her application was rubber stamped by the Ohio State Medical Board and renewed for another 2 years almost immediately. You have to excuse my French, but got to be shitting me. We did some research of our own into state medical boards. I regret to inform you that what we learned was not encouraging, namely that if state medical boards who have no intention of actually providing some check on doctors who deny basic science, like the effectiveness of vaccines in a global pandemic, the question then is begged, what is the point of state medical boards? This coronavirus pandemic is, without a doubt, the single most important test for state medical boards for all sorts of authority. And we are failing, and you are failing to meet the moment spectacularly, unless and until you start to take action. Some state medical boards have taken action. Rhode Island took action against Mark Brody for sending letters. But what is the difference between sending a letter and sending a tweet? And I'm sorry, but if your rules do not allow you to take action, then there's something wrong there. Both are purposeful communications designed to persuade patients, members of the public. The difference is that one is a guided bioweapon, a letter. The other is an indiscriminate weapon of mass destruction. on social media platforms that refuse to take action against misinformation, and we are dealing with that in other aspects of what we do. In fact, worse still, they reward engagement with misinformation, with amplification. Well, then in that world, nonsense wins. You've somehow managed to fail to understand how the internet works. I genuinely sympathize. I'm still learning from my junior staff how to use emoji. But the price of my failure is that I accidentally send LOLs and laughing emojis when someone says their cat died. Your failure is leading to people dying. Guidance and disciplinary action 6 months to a year from now is meaningless. Talking points, even speeches like this, aren't enough. Everyone who can hear my voice has a role to play. There is action that can be taken today. Here's what I would recommend, and I do so with respect and knowing that physicians around the country want you to take action too. Uphold your oath. First rule of medical ethics is do no harm. These charlatan doctors spreading vaccine disinformation and whose voices are legitimized by the state medical boards are doing enormous harm. There are people choking to death right now in ICUs, desperate to live, who will not, because they were misinformed. They're telling their doctors, can I take the vaccine now? I thought the vaccine would harm me. And they've already are on the path to losing their lives. There is nothing the public can do to stop these doctors. That is up to you. You have the power to remove an enormous source of their legitimacy. Take a stand to call out anti-vax doctors. If you're on the state medical board, get on the right side of history and do the morally right thing. Deny the license of anti-vax doctors when they come before you. And spread the word. If there's hope for the reputation of state medical board, take this fight public. Because the public will have your back if you have ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed, for those very sobering comments and that call to action. We'll now hear from Katie Templeton.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmed. We recognize today that there is a call to action, that there is the need for change, and that medical boards need to become more nimble, be able to take action more rapidly, to address crises as they arise. We recognize that state medical boards are constrained to act within the statutes and the laws which oversee them in their specific states. They must comply with the laws on the books that mandate how they proceed. And we recognize that the need for change in legislation in many jurisdictions is very present. In the past, Fsmb policy has been adopted as legislation in many states on certain topics. And we're hopeful that the guidance and the guidelines and the policy that the Federation will disseminate this coming April after our House of Delegates meeting will allow for state medical boards to have the support of the Federation and for state legislatures to look to it for guidance in how to address misinformation in this very real public health crisis. Boards in some states are to act on public health concerns. Some, professionalism and ethics are in every statute with regard to licensure of healthcare providers. And tying those public health concerns and professionalism and ethics to the conduct, the misconduct, to the dissemination of misinformation is very important, and it's an avenue to take. There are real concerns with regard to the First Amendment, with regard to due process, and we have to, comply with the law when we are addressing physicians in discipline, in suspension, and revocation of their license. But we can't hide behind the First Amendment. We can't hide behind the law to avoid taking the hard stand. And we support our medical boards in making these hard decisions to protect the public. It's a very real harm to the public that is occurring, and we support the medical boards in doing everything necessary to protect the public. One of the ways in which we believe, physicians can support the good physicians, the physicians who are, telling the truth and supporting the public and working through the pandemic, one way in which they can continue to combat the misinformation is having those relationships with their patients, connecting with their patients, determining the values of their patients. Because even if we are in a position right now where, institutional medicine is being potentially not trusted as much as it used to be, not looked upon as fondly as it used to be, patients and people are still making exceptions for their own personal physician. So even if I don't trust the institution, I trust my doctor, and I trust those that I have a relationship with. And so we need those physicians to also combat misinformation in those one-on-one communications with their physicians. Look to them to build health literacy. Look to them to continue to foster trust with their patients and speak out against their colleagues, their, other people in their profession who are disseminating this misinformation. Be vocal. Right now, there's a small group of people making a whole lot of noise with misinformation, and we need our allies, we need our colleagues, we need our, friends to come forward and also speak loudly, to speak out against misinformation, to support one another in combating misinformation. Boards have to look at where the misinformation is coming from. They have to look at, context. But more often than not, when there's misinformation being disseminated, even publicly, from a forum, wherever the case may be, they're also disseminating that misinformation in a personal relationship, in the physician-patient relationship. So when you look at things like informed consent, when you're looking at the conduct of physicians in the practice of medicine, it is all tied together. And these are different avenues that we can look at this problem and come to address it. And we, call on the state medical boards to take these hard actions. It's difficult. It's a hard issue, but it's an issue that needs to be done to protect the public. And the Federation supports you. We're here to provide guidance. And we recognize that it is difficult, that some laws need to change, that laws do need to recognize the issue of social media. Anti-vaccination has been an issue before now, but the pandemic really brought to the forefront the issue of social media. And, these physicians are profiting off of their misinformation campaigns. They're often selling you a supplement that's going to treat you instead of the vaccine and all of these different things. And we have the ability to address it. And it's tied to their conduct. It's tied to the practice of medicine. And we are here to provide some guidance and support the state medical boards as they tackle this very difficult issue. So we're now going to have a Q&A session. And I really look forward to all of your questions and hope that we can address some of your concerns today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Katie, and thanks to both of our speakers. So we will now have lots of time for Q&A from our online audience. And if you have a question or comment, please use the Q&A feature that's provided on your screen. So Imran, let's start with a question for you. Now we've seen over the course of the last 19 months that while time may not always fly during a pandemic, science can certainly advance very quickly, as can public opinion. So your Disinformation Dozen report and its sequel were published in March and April of this year. If you were to publish another update of that report today, what do you think it could include?
Well, the truth is that we did a number of subsequent reports to the Disinformation Dozen, including one which was Pandemic Profiteers, which looked at the mechanisms used to monetize misinformation. So, as was just pointed out, absolutely accurately, that this disinformation is not about just trying to dissuade people from taking vaccines. It's meant to it's meant to, it's a grooming tactic. It's a way of bringing people into a different content ecosystem and a set of beliefs, and also then selling them supplements, books, other things, access to. So it is a monetized environment. And that monetization allows for the production of more misinformation. So we've seen the evolution of the tactics, the strategies, the scale of the threat that's being posed to us. I wish that very early on we'd had the foresight to be able to go to each of those different organs of society, like the state medical boards, and say, look, here's the problem. It's going to be coming up in a few months' time. And is there something that you can do about it in advance? But we didn't. And this is good. Our ability to react to this crisis now, and then to put into place the solutions that we're going to need, the rules, the muscle memory of taking action against bad actors like this, egregiously bad actors, is going to be necessary for the next pandemic or the next time we face a public health emergency of this scale.
Thanks very much, Imran. I'll follow up on that a bit. You mentioned in your reports about the establishment of clear thresholds for enforcement action. So you talked about action from a medical regulatory standpoint as well a moment ago. Do you see these thresholds as similar, or what do you think should be the threshold for action from a state medical board? Is it also 3 strikes, you're out, like on social media, or do other metrics factor into the equation here?
So, I mean, I think that the 3 strikes and you're out is the mechanism that's chosen by some platforms. Others have 5 strikes and you're out. The reality is that it's quite a lot of strikes and you're still not out. And that's what we've seen with the disinformation doesn't. So this report that we produced that was so impactful, that had the president demanding action from Facebook and other companies, the truth is that those companies have not been your ally. That even now, 55% of the disinformation dozens accounts are still up and running. And that's really quite shocking, that there has been a serial failure to address it. So, I mean, we leave aside the failure of those companies to have, but the truth is that their sort of, their record of a huge number of strikes and you're still not out is still also the record of the state medical boards. And it's the disproportionate, the sort of the lack of action for egregious harm, even when it can be established beyond reasonable doubt that harm is being created by misinformation, that there are physicians involved in the proselytization of misinformation that's leading to human harm. Still, no action is taken. And I think the squeamishness about the First Amendment has been one of the issues. It's both a squeamishness that we've seen when it comes to the platform. They claim First Amendment, that people have a First Amendment right to spread misinformation. But then, look, here's what they say in court in private. So when Facebook is sued by someone they've deplatformed, they say, actually, you have no First Amendment right to be on a private platform. In fact, we have the First Amendment right to decide who's on our platform and who's not, because we publish this website. It is, in that respect, a similar, philosophical question that faced by the state medical boards. No one has a fundamental right to be licensed by a state medical board. You hold that decision-making power in your hands. And the First Amendment should not be a consideration when it comes to considering the good character and conduct of a physician when deciding whether or not to award them a license.
Thanks very much. I want to give Katie a chance to talk about the First Amendment concerns as well. I mean, we've seen in some instances decisions of state medical boards face legal challenges based on First Amendment grounds. And this possibility is frequently raised when it comes to medical board attempts at stopping the spread of disinformation. So Katie, do you want to offer any thoughts about this?
Yes, thank you, Mark. There is a kind of distinction, and there is a lot of case law, and we anticipate even more case law coming out with regard to the First Amendment and the difference between speech and conduct. The First Amendment right to free speech is broad, admittedly, and that's where more often, than not, it's not just a speech issue, it's also a conduct issue with a physician when they are disseminating misinformation. They're also, practicing their medicine with the same kind of not following the science perspective. But it's a very real issue that if this is only about speech, First Amendment rights are considered, they are at issue. There is case law currently that state speech isn't enough. And so the analysis is there and must be looked at closely. It's not, I wish it were quite as simple as Imran states, because certainly that would make things easier. But there are implications here with the First Amendment that must be addressed. At a recent webinar that included members from Canada and the UK, it was a little less strong than in the United States with regard to the First Amendment. And it's very much decided based on the law of the jurisdiction at the time. And some state statutes have things written into their Medical Practice Act that cover these topics, but many don't. And that's where we are looking to, the help of state legislatures and other guidance to bolster these medical practice acts to consider this very real issue.
Thank you. So you talked a bit about the parameters within which state medical boards have to work, but we're also hearing from Imran and from the public a really loud call for state medical boards to recognize that harms are occurring and to take quick and decisive action. So we're also hearing criticism when that action isn't taken, that doctors are potentially protecting their own, or that state medical boards aren't acting when they need to be acting. So Katie, first of all, and then we'll go to Imran on the same question. How can boards satisfy this cohort of frightened and angry members of the public and maintain confidence in the work that state medical boards do while also working within these parameters? Or do the parameters need to be changed?
I think the answer is D, all of the above. I do think some of the parameters do need to change. I think that the pandemic has brought forth many things that many of us didn't anticipate seeing, or, things we hadn't quite considered before. Due process is, a real thing. And even in the Constitution with regard to a speedy trial, that usually isn't as speedy as the defendant and the victim's family in a criminal trial want it to be. It's a very real concern. State medical boards can't tell people who they're investigating before a final order comes out. So when we're talking to state medical boards and they're being asked, well, are you taking any action? Have you taken any action? Until there's a final order or a final decision, they can't tell people that information. So it is a difficult balance to let the public know we're looking at this, we're working on this. I think that's why the statement from the Federation is important. I think when the state medical boards can also send out statements, when they can when laws are changed and we can point to that, I think that's going to help with the public confidence. But there is the constraint with the medical boards just in what they're allowed to say during the process. Because until that final order is entered and until that board makes the decision with regard to the physician, there's really not anything you can share in the midst of the process.
Thank you. Imran, would you care to comment?
Well, look, I think there are 2 points I'd raise here. The first is that we Brits do know, and clearly I'm British, but speaking to you from Washington, D.C., which is where I live and have made my home, that the Brits know the problem of misinformation about vaccines. Andrew Wakefield, a British physician, invented it. It was the link between autism and MMR in his paper in 98-99, published in The Lancet. In fact, he wrote it just up the road from where I was at medical school in 96, UCL. That paper caused an enormous amount of harm in the UK. The way that he was systematically, that his misinformation was dealt with was actually, it was triggered by the General Medical Council's decision to strike him off the register of physicians. And that was a signal moment. When I say that the state medical board's decision to license is really impactful, I say that from experience, because in the end, Wakefield had to leave the United Kingdom, and he eventually found his home in the United States. And it's actually the children of Wakefield that you see now. These are all the sort of the key anti-vaxxers, the people who've learned that there is profit to be made by eliding things like autism with vaccines and all sorts of other things as well, have been the sort of the children of Wakefield. So that action, if taken, can be genuinely impactful. Sorry, if it looks as though the sun's gone out on me, it's because one of these lights has failed, but there you go. I think that is really important to remember, just the sheer scale of power available to state medical boards to make a difference in this really, really serious battle that we face now on misinformation.
That's helpful to hear. And, you know, I think many would agree that there is a significant power that state medical boards wield to address this problem. But we also hear concerns around not only the parameters that have been mentioned with regard to enabling legislation, but also the fact that many state boards say that they're understaffed and underfunded to battle this problem. So we have a question from our audience about what can be done regarding this problem in those instances where there aren't a lot of resources to go around, especially when it comes to legal challenges. Let's go with Imran first, and then Katie, please.
Well, I mean, ask for them. Look, we're going to need to build systems that have resilience in, and right now, state medical boards, if they were willing to take on this task, would find a broad array of stakeholders who want to back them in it. Because I can tell you that the opposite is true as well, that there are a lot of people right now looking at state medical boards. And I'm sorry, the genie's out of the bottle. People are now looking at state medical boards and going, hold on a sec, those folk, why haven't they acted? And it's not just CNN, it's not just the other newspapers. There are legislators as well who are sitting there going, well, hold on a second. If this is a whole of society response, I just got off a speech that I gave earlier on at a roundtable with Congress, where I was talking with people from Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, who was saying that we need a whole of society response. We need a national strategy for dealing with misinformation in a pandemic, and state medical boards' ability to function as part of that national security response to pandemic is going to be part of it. So now is the moment to be asking to secure the resources and to gain public support for the changes that will be necessary to allow you to do your jobs. I know. I mean, I did mention the opioid epidemic, and I was perhaps a little bit sharp in my opening. But it's not as though you haven't had warning that there are problems caused by naughty physicians.
Katie, I doubt that you disagree that it wouldn't hurt for state medical boards to have those additional resources. But as we wait for them to arrive and as we call for them, do you have some thoughts about what state medical boards can do in the current situation with regard to misinformation, disinformation?
I think just the state medical boards themselves collaborating with each other. Most of the physicians that we see, are tied to more than one board, with the, ability to travel. Society today is just not quite as stationary as it once was. And so many people are licensed in multiple states. And I think those boards collaborating together would really be a useful tool to all of the boards to kind of look at it as kind of playing on the same team, as opposed to, 71 different silos, that they're all working to protect the public, and the other state medical board, are teammates of theirs in this process.
Thanks, Katie. On that topic of state medical boards working together, we have a couple of questions from the audience about, first of all, what the Fsmb can do in terms of addressing this at the level of individual physicians. So can the Fsmb revoke or suspend a license? And we also have a question about what types of conversations have been occurring among state medical boards and between the Fsmb and state medical boards about this topic. And Katie, those are for you.
Yes. The Federation cannot revoke a physician's license on the state level. Their license is granted by the state or territory in which they practice, and that ability to do so, the ability to revoke or suspend or discipline or remediate or educate, the ability to do any of those things is within that state medical board. Reciprocal actions occur between state medical boards if there's discipline in one state. Reciprocal actions occur in other states, but the Federation is an advisory kind of entity to the state and territorial boards to provide them guidance, to provide them resources, and to provide them support. We don't have the authority or the ability to discipline any individual physician in that regard. With regard to conversations that are happening, conversations are happening between the Federation and the individual state boards. We have a committee, the Ethics and Professionalism Committee, who disseminated the statement at the end of July with regard to misinformation, are working currently on drafting the guidelines and are collaborating. The members of that committee are from various state boards. Additional conversations have been occurring between state boards and committee members and the Federation, just with regard to kind of ideas and ways to combat this, sharing of resources while we're waiting for the formal guidelines to be finalized.
Great. We have a question from the audience, and I think this one's for Imran. What advice do you have for those of us who live and work in states where the public and the legislators don't support the message presented today?
The reason they don't support it is because of the misinformation. That's the point, is that when we're rolling back the sheer harm that's been created by, first of all, the spread of misinformation, second of all, the belief in misinformation amongst the public, and third, those utterly unscrupulous, cynical politicians who sought to instrumentalize misinformation and sought to create constituencies by telling people who've swallowed misinformation, hey, I believe it too, I'm with you, why don't you vote for me? And that's really where we are. We're at this advanced stage where the cancer has spread to the point where it's consuming the entire body. When we're in real trouble here. And so the fight back has to start with courage. But the amazing thing is that that physicians still carry an enormous amount of trust and weight. The reason why the third of those three things that misinformation actors seek to persuade people of, A, coronavirus isn't that bad, B, vaccines are dangerous, C, that you can't trust doctors. The reason why doctors have to be defeated as part of that strategy is because they still hold enormous amounts of trust. So we did polling very early on in the pandemic to look at trust levels and to see if we could find if trust in certain authorities correlated with vaccine hesitancy. And in short, we found that basically across the board, across all communities, across all political inclinations, people don't trust politicians. People had varying levels of trust in social media, and if they trust in social media, they were much more likely to be vaccine hesitant. But the one group that they had enormous amounts of trust in was still scientists, and in particular, their physicians. So you represent a profession that still holds enormous amounts of persuasive power. And if you're the one saying that the politicians need to shut it, we're the ones who are speaking for the profession and for science itself and for medicine. We're the people who've treated you and your families for decades. They're going to trust you. You will win this battle. It will just take courage.
So Imran, is the approach different when the audience includes people who don't have their own physician? We have a question from the audience here that states that a lot of people are incredibly hesitant about vaccines and are being bombarded with misinformation and disinformation, but they may not have their own primary care physician or may not regularly see a doctor. So how do we reach these people and get the message across to them?
So those inequities in access to healthcare in the United States have made it particularly problematic. So the difference between, say, the United States, which has massive inequalities in access to healthcare, and the UK, where there's a National Health Service, which is a single authority that's able to tell people, this is what the medical profession believes. That's driven the enormous vaccine uptake rate in the UK versus the pretty sort of poor lagging rate in the US. And there is definitely a socioeconomic factor, that element to vaccine hesitancy. But in those instances, you have to be harnessing every aspect of community healthcare, but also other figures as well from within the community who are amenable to the messaging and who are able to. So it means forming coalitions at a local level with community activists, with people that are able to do that. There's an enormous amount of work that's being done around the country on trying to connect up physicians and give them access into communities that they haven't typically had access into, working with communities, with individual communities, and particularly deprived communities, to get that access. I'm sorry, I can't give you an easier response to that. It's just going to it will take shoe leather and hard work, but it's got to be done, because this has shown a systemic weakness in the capacity of state medical boards and the medical profession to respond to a pandemic crisis. Unless we take this as a warning of what might happen in future, and put into place the mitigating institutions, but also processes to deal with it, we're going to be in real trouble.
Thanks very much. Now, what about situations where a doctor posts information or misinformation on social media without actually identifying as a doctor? So there's a distinction here between this type of posting versus, communicating with patients within a clinical setting or posting on an office webpage. Katie, what are state medical boards to do in these situations?
I think they have to look at the entirety of the context. They also need to look at, it's hard to disconnect when you are a physician that, am I wearing my physician hat or am I not? You really can't take it off because you are a physician. So the entirety of the context matters. I think when you're posting on social media, you're reaching people know you as a physician. There's still concern that you are within the realm of your license and disseminating false information. And we can always go back to the professionalism, the ethics. You can't take off those hats either. And state medical boards address, non-patient care issues when they become a public health concern, whether it's, addiction issues or those parameters that may not be as direct as, something happening in the clinical setting. And we need to look at this through the same lens that we look at those. It's still a risk of public harm. The case may be more difficult to make, but more likely than not, if they're disseminating false information on social media, they're also using that false information in their practice as well. There are those people who were vaccinated and told others not to be vaccinated. We've seen that across, politics, media, et cetera. And in that context, that's a real ethical issue, more so than a practice of medicine issue even. So I think you have to look at the entirety of the situation. You have to do your investigation. You have to look at the other issues surrounding that licensee and, deal with everything together.
So I think that response, Katie, actually speaks to the distinction between misinformation and disinformation. So misinformation being where there might not necessarily be knowledge that the information is false or intent to distribute false information, whereas disinformation would be disseminating false information on purpose while knowing that it's false. So, the situation where a physician is actually vaccinated but talks about the dangers of vaccines with their patients might be one way in which intent can be determined by state medical boards. How should this factor into regulatory considerations? What are some other ways where intent might be determined? And at the end of the day, does it matter with respect to the mission of state medical boards to protect the public?
With regard to, does it matter? Yes and no. Because the misinformation is still damaging to the public. The misinformation is still, can be deadly, whether it's innocent or not. Where it matters, kind of ties back into that First Amendment issue also, in that, is it reckless? Is it, so inherently unbelievable? And those are factors that state medical boards, have to look at, maybe even from the context of, if it's innocent, can we remediate? Can we provide extra education? Can we do something to correct the behavior of the physician that may be less than a suspension or revocation, because the ultimate goal is for physicians to keep practicing, but to do so safely and to protect the public. When it's egregious, when it's reckless, when it's intentional, then I think you're looking at potentially higher levels of discipline. You're looking at greater concern than I was wrong when I'm intentionally trying to mislead the public. I think it's looking at the gravity of the conduct of the physician.
Thanks, Katie. Imran, with respect to your research and the disinformation dozen that you've identified, is intent ever in question? Is this purely disinformation, or may it be misinformation in some circumstances?
It's a really profoundly interesting question. Like, how can you tell the motivations of an actor? Is it genuinely being misinformed? Does, for example, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., one of the members of the disinformation dozen, the son of the late Robert Kennedy, who sadly has been disowned by his own family, the son for the disinformation he spread about vaccines. And people ask me, well, is he doing it because of belief? Is he doing it for money? What's he doing it for? And the truth is, I can't tell you. I can't tell you what's in the hearts of any individual. What's causing them to do it. But we can deduce mens rea, so the intent, the reasons why people are doing things, from things like, do they do it hundreds and hundreds of times? Do they use their doctor title? Do they, what are the mechanisms that they are using to spread that information, that misinformation? And from that, a reasonable person would conclude that this is, in fact, a pattern of behavior. Disinformation. With each of the disinformation dozen, which includes physicians, still licensed physicians, and there are others in our list beyond that dozen that are impactful that nevertheless didn't make our top 12, who produced 2/3 of the misinformation that we see on social media platforms, that there is a sufficient pattern of behavior that a reasonable person will conclude that they are knowingly spreading that misinformation. And so it is, in effect, disinformation, a sort of a technical difference between the two, and one that I don't think is necessarily enormously helpful.
Thank you. We actually have a related question from our audience. And this person asks about distinguishing between anti-science and genuine disagreement. So this person says that they're not a physician, but is it possible for a physician to genuinely disagree with his or her colleagues with regard to the efficacy of the vaccine? And if so, does he or she have a right to that opinion, regardless of whether it's a minority opinion? And I think this relates also to questions we've heard about whether stopping some of this information from being spread, whether it's misinformation or not, could potentially halt medical progress and stop people from questioning the status quo in constructive or positive ways that lead to important medical developments. Imran, do you have any thoughts about this?
I mean, my general argument would be that the scientific method doesn't really progress in the realm of memes. If you've got a picture of a coffin, Bill Gates with horns on his head, and ivermectin is the solution, then I don't consider that to be legitimate scientific. It's not the Socratic method, let's put it that way. So I think that we misunderstand the nature and the insidious nature of how misinformation works. Misinformation is usually based on, and conspiracism in particular, is nearly always based on a leap of faith, a non-falsifiable hypothesis, something that can't be disproved to be false. Nothing is more anathema to the scientific method than a non-disprovable hypothesis. That's the whole point of science, is that you have hypotheses and you test them. And if the evidence supports, then you accept the alternative hypothesis. So, I mean, the fact that misinformation is usually actually based on leaps of faith, it's based on the desire to cause doubt where there shouldn't be doubt, to obfuscate the clarity of the scientific consensus using untrue statements or statements based on sentiment. I mean, every scientist has learned about science and how we progress it, and they've made their profession their living through doing so. To undermine the scientific method in such a way, I would say that is unforgivable, to be frank.
Katie, we have a related question for you. This is about misinformation being frequently presented through emotional arguments and appeals to emotions, whether it's fear or power or other emotions. So this person asks, how could and should medical boards adapt and evolve to communicate more effectively in an emotionally charged environment?
It's a good question. I think, it's a call on the medical boards, but I also think it's a call on the physicians within the practice of medicine to, continue to rely on science and data. This misinformation is meant to, send off alarm bells and, looking at patients who, are kind of figure out where their fear is coming from. It may be a fear of personal autonomy. It may be a fear of government control. It may be a fear of, catching the virus. It may be a fear of, related medical issues to it. You kind of have to figure out where the person is coming from to be able to connect with them. And I think kind of touching on this idea of asking questions and, the scientific method and everything like that, it's asking questions is a good thing, but you still have to stay within the realm of science. And many of the things that have been, people are still touting with misinformation have been disproven. And we all need to keep going back to the data and the facts. And there's been, by now with regard to vaccines, billions of people have received them. And so when you're looking at those, you still need to go back to the data and just taking off that emotion. Medical boards and medical associations kind of dial it back. It's kind of like when you've got a toddler, like you've got to be the adult in the room, or, the flight attendants keep everyone calm on the airplane. Those sorts of situations, like we need to be the ones that keep going back to science and don't engage with the memes, with the overly emotional kind of retorts or responses. We need to be the ones to stay, the professionals and relying on that scientific data.
Great. Let's stick with emotions for a minute here. And Imran, a question for you. We know that fear can be a really powerful motivator in terms of some members of the public being reluctant to become vaccinated. Now, they say that people scare a lot more easily than they unscare. But do you have any thoughts about how we can effectively unscare people?
But that is such an important observation, that really what's driving the massive uptick in conspiracism and belief in misinformation is that this is a moment of great anxiety. Anxiety is really correlated with epistemic anxiety. So not just an anxiety about knowing what's true or not, but not even knowing where to get that information from. Big correlation to conspiracism and to belief in conspiracy theories. So this is a moment of great anxiety, and that's natural. It's a novel pathogen. We didn't know an enormous amount about it, and as the scientific method has progressed and our understanding of the data, so has the balance of probabilities and therefore the conclusions come to by physicians, scientists, and those who've been working to mitigate this pandemic. So that's been going on, and in that period, to those people that most acutely felt that anxiety and fear, that just couldn't cope with the fact that they didn't know why everything was changing, why people were dying, why they felt so scared, that there were people creeping along and feeding them misinformation. We actually infiltrated a meeting of anti-vaxxers. They talked about creating answering spaces. So when people express their vulnerabilities, to then leap on them, because that's a moment of great vulnerability. And I see the same tactic being used, not just in terms of leaping on people in moments of vulnerability and anxiety, but also distancing them from common authorities. These are grooming tactics. It's used in child sexual exploitation. It's used in terrorism recruitment as well. And these are the tactics of how you pull people away from the authorities that they normally trust, how you feed them misinformation in moments when they're vulnerable. And it's why, to some extent, I feel a real anger towards these people, because especially the physicians, because they know better, and they're taking advantage of the most vulnerable amongst us, and not giving them the right information, which is that 6.7 billion doses of the vaccine have been administered around the world. 2.9 billion people are fully vaccinated. That's more than a third of all human beings on Earth. 5 million are dead from COVID. How many vaccine reactions have there been? These people keep saying that millions will die. Rashid Buttar last night on CNN said that by the end of the by 2025, millions of people will have died. Well, that's because no one has died yet, but they have of COVID. And so these key facts are being obfuscated, which actually would help people to understand what's going on. And instead, they're being fed misinformation by people posing as physicians, or not posing as physicians, given the right to be physicians thanks to state medical boards.
Thank you. We've got a few more minutes here, so maybe we'll take one or two more questions from the audience. A couple of them have to do with the roles of other organizations within the House of Medicine. So we have one question about how organizations responsible for board certification can play a role. And we have another question about how medical education should help in confronting this issue. So Imran, why don't we ask you about medical education? How do we ensure that the next generation of physicians doesn't become increasingly prone to spreading misinformation and disinformation?
Really difficult, because they're going to be operating in an information environment that's radically changed to the one that we've enjoyed for decades, if not centuries, in which just the very title doctor afforded a position of authority which gave you both the right and the responsibility to protect the public. Now, first of all, information is going to be flowing in ways, and patients are going to be accessible and looking for information in new ways. But I've never found anyone smarter than young people when it comes to understanding how the world of information, how we create facts, we create sentiments, we create values in our society has changed as a result of digital platforms. As I said, I genuinely mean that I don't know how to use emojis. I keep sending the wrong ones all the time. But young people do. And there's perhaps something to be learned from younger people. I'm not sure if it's the younger physicians that need that medical education or education on how the world is changing in a profound and important way, and how our institutions are failing to match up to the problem. I think perhaps you might find that some of them are quite useful teachers.
Thank you. I'm sure I'd be great at using emojis if I didn't refuse to use them. Katie, we'll give you the last question, and it's about board certification. So what should be the role of board certification authorities and the medical specialty societies in addressing this issue? We heard you talk a lot about medical professionalism at the beginning. What do these organizations have to say?
I think they have a role. I think everyone in the House of Medicine has a role in combating misinformation and addressing this problem. We do know that some board specialties have stated that you will lose board certification for the unprofessional behavior of disseminating misinformation. And I think that continuing to address it from all areas of the House of Medicine, it's going to take everyone. It's going to take everyone working together to combat this issue. And I think we need to realize that we're all on the same team, and we all have the same goal, and we're trying to protect the public. And everyone needs to do so within the avenue that they've been granted to do so.
Great. I think that's a promising note of hope for us to wrap on. I want to thank Mr. Imran Ahmed and Ms. Katie Templeton again for their outstanding presentations and their graciousness during this lengthy Q&A. So thanks also to our online audience for your participation. And as a reminder, this webinar has been accredited for continuing medical education credit. So if you wish to claim CMU credit, you'll be redirected to the activity evaluation, and upon its completion, you'll be able to generate A certificates. Imran's got a point before we wrap. Yes.
Sorry, just to say, my team say that some folks are saying that they've been trying to DM me, but they can't because I don't allow people to direct message me on social media. But if you want to get hold of me, it's info@counterhate.com. I'm more than happy to continue the discussion with any of you, and I look forward to continuing it with state medical boards in particular.
Thanks very much. That's important. info@counterhate.com. Thanks very much, Imran. Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks to you both, and thanks to our audience again for participating in today's event. We hope you all enjoyed it, and we wish you a great afternoon.